So this paper is the beginning of a new project, and so I'm at that exciting stage where I go back and forth between thinking this is the best idea in the history of ideas, and these are the ravings of a madman. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with that stage, so we'll see how it goes. And it comes, part of the impetus for this is teaching. So when you teach poetry, you often get the question, what is this poem about? Students, who are typically somewhat flummoxed by poetry, mean this question in two ways. They are asking what the poem is about at the level of paraphrasable content, what the poem would look like if it were reduced to a prose narrative. Like anyone cares about prose. But they are also asking about what they've been trained, although never by me, to call the poem's deeper meaning. In which case the answer they want will be human isolation in a mechanistic world, or the undecidable complexity of moral choices, or something of that kidney. My challenge in teaching is to answer both these questions in ways that will be satisfactory and helpful to the students, while still asserting that having a meaning is, to paraphrase Mutlu Kunak blazing in her lyric poetry, The Pain and Pleasure of Words, a book you should all know, not an important or interesting thing for a poem to do. I think she says that for a poem to mean something is the dullest thing a poem can do. As Archibald MacLeish said in the final lines of his Ars Poetica, a poem should not mean but be. I too am astonished that I'm quoting Archibald MacLeish. So in this paper I want to look at some of the ways in which Shakespeare deals with questions of meaning and interpretation in some of his poems. The paper takes as its starting point some of the themes and questions I discussed in Shakespeare and Queer Representation. So if, as seems likely, you have read that book several times and committed it to memory, some of it will seem familiar. Sorry. I also work with something I brought up in a roundtable I was at Oxford, and both Robert and Goran were there. So for that part of my paper, you may devote yourself to Maiden Meditation Fancy Free, I think I'll go with. So I'm going to begin with a somewhat theoretical discussion and then look at a few Shakespeare poems from the point of view of aboutness. The question of what a text is about is a complex one, perhaps surprisingly so. Aboutness is an important topic in library and information science, for instance, as in order for books to be assigned a call number, it has first to be determined what the primary subject of the book is. This is often not at all straightforward, and it is increasingly complex in an age of interdisciplinary research. But even dealing with the question of what one short poem is about is harder than might appear at first. One of the most helpful discussions of the topic, here as elsewhere, when I say something is helpful, I mean I like it. I don't mean it will actually be helpful to anyone, but you'll have your chance to give your own talk at some other point. So one of the most helpful discussions of the topic can be found in the introduction that the American poet Lynn Heginian wrote to a collection of her essays. Quote, poetry, to use William James's phrase, is in the transition as much as in the things connected. This is not to say that poetry is about transition, but that aboutness is transitional, transitory. Poetry, and perhaps life, calls traditional notions of aboutness into question, unquote. See? Helpful. It is this line of thought that I want to pursue in this essay. I want to look at how poems can make us think about how we derive meaning from them, and to some extent, why we would want to. I think the short answer to the question of why someone would want to is that they are what we used to call, this is my favorite slur in graduate school, an epistemophiliac. And so that would be their problem. One method people use to avoid dealing with poems as poems, it's true, is to reduce them to relatively unambiguous prose statements, thus deciding what the aboutness of the poem in question is. I think that we should instead focus on the poem as a poem, and I can't believe that that is still considered surprising, but there you go. In her brilliant Poetic Artifice, A Theory of 20th Century Poetry, the always invigorating Veronica Thompson summed up the situation clearly. We begin with, quote, the fiction that this is a man talking to us about something, why else should we care? But we need not assume that he is talking about something outside the poem, be it his feelings or his ideas or his situation. If so, why should he bother to write a poem, unquote. I love her so much. I would answer the first question chiefly by saying that we care because we care about poetry, but I'm certainly in agreement with her second question. Admittedly, many poets write poetry in order to make general statements that have no particular interest in or talent for poetry, but then we don't care about these poets. For instance, Robert Browning. On the one hand, I'm endorsing Derrida's famous, indeed notorious, Il n'y a pas de hors texte, or at least I'm saying that I'm not interested in the hors texte. On the other, I'm saying that for me, the important aboutness of any poem is the fact of the poem itself. Poetry is the subject of poems. You know, when I teach the Milton class, I always urge students to get something from Milton tattooed on them. And I think if you're going to get something from this talk today tattooed, I'd recommend poetry as the subject of poems. Okay, so just putting that out there. So my point is not that poetry is meaningless, however. Sorry. While it is true that over the last 100 years, a number of poets have written poems that resist and even repel paraphrase, my interest is in how words, which after all do have meanings, however transitional and transitory they may be, how words make meanings that are not always under the poet's or the reader's control. Here I'm thinking of what John Ashbury wrote for the dust jacket of his third collection of poems, The Tennis Court Oath, which was first published in 1962. He says, I attempt to use words abstractly as an abstract painter would use paint. This has nothing to do with images, and we're using words because of their sound. Words are inseparable from their meaning and cannot be said to exist apart from it. My aim is to give the meaning free play and the fullest possible range. That's so good. In giving the words this kind of power, poets obviously surrender much of what we would tend to see as their own control over the poems. Ashbury's aim here may seem unusual or extreme. I would say instead that he is merely being more honest about the agency of words, both by themselves and in combination. Especially in poetry, where words are in any case less subject to the ruthless power of narrative than they are in plays or prose fiction, what we call the minor genres, words may take the poem in a number of unexpected directions. It is also the case that part of the meaning of the words in a poem can lie in non-semantic areas, sound or rhythm, for instance. The first two lines of Shakespeare's first sonnet provide a good example. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. I actually thought you would all chorus that along with me. You have let me down. But so I recommend reading Sonnet 1. Yep. These lines are typically seen as forming part of the plea for the young man to marry and have children that is the subject of the first group of sonnets, often called the Procreation sonnets, just so that no one will ever want to read them. I'm not entirely opposed to this reading, as the lines work well with many other lines in these early sonnets, but it seems to me that the situation is not so straightforward. We could paraphrase the lines as meaning, we want beautiful beings to reproduce in order for beauty to continue, but some elements in the lines complicate this paraphrase. For one thing, the first line has the sonic parallel of creatures and increase, a parallel that is strengthened by the assonating we that is between them. Placed so close together, creatures and increase might seem to offer an example of polyptoton, but in fact the two words come from different Latin roots. When we read them as connected in their derivation, as the line suggests that we should, we are constructing a false genealogy, something that clashes with the idea of a patrilineal descent exemplifying a true genealogy that these opening sonnets are assumed to endorse. The second line is also somewhat more complex than we might expect. As I have suggested, a paraphrase of this line would lead us to gloss it as referring to the continued existence of beauty in the children of the young man. This paraphrase is made possible by what comes later in the sonnet and in the sonnets that follow it, which I think is kind of a bad sign, if you can only interpret something by what comes after it. But on closer examination, we can see a difficulty. I refer to the question of the meaning of beauty's rose. This is the first mention of the rose in the sonnets, and it will certainly become one of the most important images in the sequence as a whole. As an undergraduate, I wrote a very messy essay on the image of the rose in Shakespeare's sonnets, so take heart. Here, however, the usage seems odd and even redundant. Roses are famously symbols of beauty and of love, so why is it necessary to specify that this rose belongs to beauty? It could just mean a visible manifestation of beauty as opposed to an abstract idea of beauty, but the young man also provides this visual manifestation that Shakespeare never tires of telling us. Beauty's rose is something that is visible and tangible and not subject to the nightmarish degradations of the aging process, and Shakespeare is also very keen on showing us, on stressing these degradations, at least in the earlier sonnets. Part of what I see as a problem in the general understanding of the sonnet is that we understand it by paraphrasing elements that come later in the poem or in the poems that follow, and thus we begin by understanding it as a poet's exhortation to a young man to have children. If we stick to the poem as a poem, I think things become more interesting. First of all, the word increase, which is, as I said, stressed by its similarity to creatures and by the assonance, does not have to refer to having children. It might, but then again, it might not. After all, in its sonic complexity, the first line of the sonnet gives us an example of a kind of increase that has nothing to do with children. At this point, we can return to beauty's rose. The visible manifestation of beauty is usually taken to be the children who will reproduce the young man's beauty once time has destroyed his own, but this is not the only possible interpretation. We could instead take beauty's rose to mean the sonnet itself and all the sonnets that follow it. If we are to use material from later sonnets to interpret this phrase, that material does not have to be the reference to hypothetical children. And of course, I always point out to students, the basic idea that you have, a beautiful man will have children so that, to reproduce his beauty. What if your children are losers? This is the big problem with the eugenic argument behind the sonnets. I mean no disrespect to any actual children anyone in the room has, who I'm sure are great kids. Okay. So we could understand it as a reference to the sonnets that will preserve the beloved's beauty, a theme that becomes increasingly explicit and important in the sequence. That is, we could see the first two lines of this first sonnet as setting up a paradigm in which the aboutness of the poems is concerned with poetry itself. The last time I taught the sonnets, I said to the students, maybe the real boyfriend was the sonnets we wrote along the way. and I think that's actually probably true. Up to this point, I've been discussing interpretations of poetry. I want now to turn to Shakespeare's Lucrece, a poem that is centrally concerned with how its eponymous character learns to interpret. In the fact, the poem could be said to detail Lucrece's painful and ultimately fatal education and interpretation. At the beginning of the poem, when Tarquin comes to her house, she appears to be utterly unaware of the very existence of interpretation. It does not occur to her that Tarquin, who looks at her in such a friendly manner, could be evil. But she that never coped with stranger eyes could pick no meaning from their parling looks, nor read the subtle shining secrecies writ in the glossy margins of such books. The quality of Lucrece is just up and down like a toilet seat. It's just so variable. It has so many great passages, and there are others where it's just, you just have to look away. So the comparison of faces and books is not unusual. Here it is a book she could not read despite how obvious it is. Not only are his looks speaking, parling, as Shakespeare says, but even what he seeks to hide, his secrecies, are simultaneously subtle and shining. The alliteration here underlines how obvious his true nature is, obvious to anyone who understands interpretation, that is. Finally, his secrets are written in a margin that is both glossy and, of course, a gloss. Shakespeare goes to great lengths here to stress Lucrece's extreme innocence. After the rape, Lucrece is better equipped to deal with the difference between appearance and reality, although still only to a limited amount. In the famous scene in which she looks at a painting of the fall of Troy, for instance, much of the passage is taken up with a consideration of Sinon, who betrayed the Trojans to the Greeks. In the painting, he appears completely harmless, and Lucrece initially sees his gentle looks as a problem with the artist, who she feels did not know how properly to portray wicked intentions. Soon enough, however, she makes the parallel with her own situation. To me came Tarquin armed, so beguiled with outward honesty, but yet defiled with inward vice. Lucrece has learned, too late, the necessity of interpretation. This new awareness does not prevent her from physically attacking the depiction. She tears the senseless scion with her nails. But she does conclude in the line that ends this part of the poem with a further sign of her education. "Fool, fool," quoth she, "his wounds will not be sore." Lucrece now recognizes both that representation may be deceitful and that representations are exactly that, rather than granting access to what we humorously call real life. Near the beginning of this passage, however, Shakespeare indicates that learning the rules of representation may draw viewers further into representation rather than to a fuller understanding of life. So I refer to the reference to the depiction of Achilles, which is one of the most famous parts of the poem. For Achilles' image stood his spear, gripped in an armed hand, himself behind was left unseen, save to the eyes of mind, the eye of mind. A hand, a foot, a face, a leg, a head stood for the whole to be imagined. Lucrece is obviously not so literal that she is unable to use her imagination to piece together these fragments into a complete portrait. But in doing so, she of course endorses the illusion. Not only is there no complete portrait of Achilles in the painting, but there's no such thing as a portrait of Achilles anywhere. He is a fictional character. Even if we were to assume that Shakespeare believed that Achilles was a real person, which seems like a big if to me, he would, of course, still have known that he invented the painting of Achilles that Lucrece is looking at. To see the real Achilles, whatever the word real might mean in that context, is merely to surrender to artistic representation. And so we see all meaning is impossible. Oh, sorry, that's not the conclusion. Of course, artistic representation is highlighted in this passage from the beginning, as the obvious intertext for this scene is the famous passage from the first book of the Aeneid, in which Aeneas and Achates look at paintings of the fall of Troy on the temple of Juno near Carthage. The sight moves Aeneas to say to Achates, this is such a famous line, Solve metus fertet haec aliquem tibi fama salutem. Dispel your fear, this fame will bring you some peace. No, I'm not happy with that translation either, but what are you going to do? Although in the next line Virgil describes the pictures as empty, inani, he says, Aeneas is correct. The paintings that depict the end of one narrative inaugurate the narratives that will ultimately lead to the foundation of the Roman Empire, that is the subject of the Aeneid. The relationship of this story to Shakespeare's parallel at first seems to be one of simple inversion. A few hundred lines later, Lucrece kills herself in front of her husband, her father, and a large number of the Roman aristocracy. One of her main concerns has been that what she sees as her shame will be immortalized in stories, songs, and poems. The existence of Shakespeare's poem, to say nothing of the numerous depictions of the story in almost every artistic medium, demonstrates that her fears were justified. While Aeneas is famous as the hero who led his people from Troy to Italy and founded the world's greatest empire, Lucrece is still famous for having been raped and for having killed herself. But I think the story is even more depressing than this. And making things more depressing is what we call pedagogy. So, once Lucrece has killed herself, we get an unseemly dispute over ownership between her husband and her father, and then her corpse is paraded through the streets of Rome as an example of the injustice and wickedness of the kings. The result is that Tarquin is deposed and Rome becomes a republic. As the prose argument that precedes the poem and that focuses on the establishment of the republic at the expense of Lucrece's own story shows, the story is not about her. Some critics have argued that in killing herself, Lucrece turns herself into a text. I would say rather that she is turned into a pretext and is used by the anti-monarchical faction in Rome. Thus, the relation between Aeneas contemplating the paintings of the fall of Troy and Lucrece contemplating the paintings of the fall of Troy is repetition rather than inversion. In both cases, a character's turn toward artistic representation contributes to the glory of Rome. While Aeneas directly contributes to that glory, Lucrece does so only indirectly and only as an instrument rather than as an agent. In this case, my point is not that Shakespeare's poem is only about poetry, but rather it is about how art can be politics by other means. Poetry here is not a closed circuit so much as it is in Sonnet 1, but rather part of a larger narrative altogether. All poems lead to Rome. I think that's a really good sentence that you could also use as a tattoo. All poems lead to Rome. But now back to the sonnets. Yes, it's dizzying, isn't it? The first four sonnets are in some ways all versions of each other. And this is the problem with Shakespeare's sequence as a whole. There are a lot of sonnets that are the same sonnet. Each implores the young man to have children so that his beauty will be preserved. Here, for instance, is the couplet of Sonnet 4. Thy unused beauty must be tuned with thee, which used lives the executor to be. The distinction between unused and used beauty is deeply creepy, isn't it? In the fifth sonnet, however, which is, as you recall, Shakespeare's best sonnet, Shakespeare makes the crucial shift to thinking of technologies for preserving beauty. As we can see in the opening lines, these hours that with gentle work did frame the lovely gaze where every eye doth dwell. Here he uses two words, work and frame, that present natural processes as the result of conscious effort, and that suggest human endeavors rather than reproduction. In this case, it is the hours that perform the work. But by the third quatrain, after describing winter's devastation, Shakespeare turns to the technology of perfumery. Then were not summer's distillation left a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass, beauty's effect with beauty were bereft. Later, of course, just a few poems later, Shakespeare will identify poetry as the agent of preservation. But I would argue that this identification was already present in the play on pent and its near homophone penned. In the context of this paper, what interests me most is the question of aboutness. So here I'm not referring to the aboutness of the poem, but rather to the aboutness of the flower. What is a flower about? Isn't that just such a great question? Do not Google it. What is a flower about? Or more generally, what is a plant about? And what is a plant anyway? The couplet of Sonnet 5 has an answer to these questions that may seem surprising. But flowers distill, though they with winter meet, least but their show, their substance still lives sweet. To me, at least, it seems odd to say that the substance of the rose, for instance, we only talking about roses, is not the show, the celebrated colored petals that form the blossoms, or even the rose bushes themselves, or even those parts of them that ensure that more roses can be grown. And this last aspect would seem to fit perfectly with Shakespeare's stress on reproduction throughout these early sonnets. Instead, the fragrance of the roses, preserved in the attar that is distilled from masses and masses of petals, is the substance of the flower, which is to say that the flower's substance is insubstantial. It has no weight or spatial extension or mass or shape, or at least none of those things that could be detected by the instruments of Shakespeare's time. What is more, while the scent of the rose persists in the attar, the scent of the attar soon dissipates once the liquid is no longer pent in walls of glass. The flower's substance is thus both insubstantial and temporary. That is, it resembles the young man's beauty more than it preserves it. To a certain extent, Shakespeare presents the preservation that distillation provides as itself evanescent in order eventually to present poetry as a more lasting and effective preservative agent. In this respect, distilling the scent of roses is one of the modes of preserving the young man's beauty that is considered and then rejected in favor of poetry. In these, like for instance, music and visual arts in some of the sonnets that follow. But I think he also wants to make a point about the nature of poetry itself. It is to poetry that Shakespeare will turn as the best way to celebrate and preserve the man's beauty. But as the comparison to the attar of roses suggests, this is a different mode of preservation than having children. When I teach this, I always say to students, which would you rather have, perfume or children? And it's just such an obvious choice, isn't it? The young man's children will reproduce his beauty, or so the theory goes, in being themselves also living beings, beautiful living beings. In contrast, the attar of roses preserves the living flower by becoming something else entirely, something that is not even alive. The lives, that is the penultimate word of Sonnet 5, is after all strictly metaphorical. We could say that the young man and his hypothetical children are on the literal side of the verb to live, while the attar of roses and the sonnets themselves are on the metaphorical side. Shakespeare, of course, will go on to tell the young man that his eternal summer shall not fade, because he will live on in the eternal lines of poetry. But that is in Sonnet 18, which famously begins by insisting on its status as a simile. So in what remains, I want to look at two slightly later poems that I think are interestingly related to Shakespeare's image of poetry as a distillation. Now, however technical making perfume from roses may seem to us now, distilling was a common household activity in Shakespeare's time. So too was preserving fruit, and in this connection I want to quote these lines from Andrew Marvell's Upon Appleton House. This is from the Lesbian Nun section. So through the mortal fruit we boil the sugar's uncorrupting oil, and that which perished while we pull is thus preserved clean and full. Unlike the clear liquid produced by distilling petals, the fruit pumped full of sugar will still look like a fruit, but it will taste much better. It's confusing. In England, you have something called sugar plums, which are not at all plum related, but then you also have something called sugar plums that is plum related. Both of them are inferior products. For this kind of thing, you have to go to the land of my ancestors, South Africa, where it's called confeit. If you can't get to South Africa, the Albanians do something very similar with tangerines, and oh my God. And so Albania is just a short flight from London, so. I could do a tour with this book. It's such a great idea. Anyway, so the fruit pumped full of sugar tastes better than real fruit because sugar, right? So in this metaphor, poetry would still resemble its subject, but it would represent it by elevating it to a higher level. The artifice of confectionary preserves the fruit and its form, its actual shape, but we could say that it renders its form a poetic form. A crucial difference, however, is that while this process will preserve the fruit, it will only do so for a certain period of time. In any case, the fruit is, after all, meant to be eaten. As is the case with the attar of roses, the preservation is only temporary. So my final passage, perhaps this is the solution, who knows, it comes from Milton's Paradise Lost, a poem that I would argue is as concerned with aesthetics as with salvation. I mean, that's how I teach it. I never even get to the religion part, because I don't care. In Book 5, Raphael explains to Adam that all things in the world, and indeed beyond it, are made of one material. This is Milton's famous monism, and ideally tend toward the insubstantial. You're not going to be able to hear this from my reading, but the enjambments here are crazy. So from the root springs lighter the green stalk, from thence the leaves more airy, last the bright consummate flower spirits odorous breathes. Here and elsewhere in Paradise Lost, Milton raises the possibility that humans, at least before the fall, might evolve into angels. Thus, he presents the plants as exemplifying a process, as well as being one sort of organism. Milton's formulation here recalls Shakespeare in Sonnet 5, with the difference that Shakespeare explicitly presents the flower's fragrance as its real substance. But Milton sees substance itself as something to transcend. This is chiefly because Milton is thinking of the ultimate salvation of heaven, which would entail leaving earth behind, while Shakespeare is thinking of preserving a living being's existence on earth. Partaking as it does of the ethereal nature of the angels, Milton's spirits odorous might seem much more exalted than Shakespeare's liquid prisoner or Marvel's sugared fruit. Yet all of these serve as images of how poetry transforms its subject matter, transforms and improves, I would say. Whatever the object at the beginning of the poem, and whatever it becomes at the end, in the case of Shakespeare's sonnet, we move from the young men to the flowers that serve as a metaphor, and then to the rosewater. It is this transformation that is the real subject of poetry. Or at least, it is this that is the important subject of poetry for me. And now for you. The aim of the poet should be to produce poetry rather than portraits. The result, as Wallace Stevens has pointed out, is ghostlier demarcations, keener lines. Thank you.